In this lecture, we'll be taking a closer look at human dentition and its importance in the work of anthropologists. As William Bass points out in his primer on the human skeletal system, the study of teeth is very important to the anthropologist and paleontologist because teeth are constructed of dense and hard material. They resist decay in the ground and often outlast bone. Consequently, he writes, teeth have played an important role in the study of fossil man or fossil humans. When we look at the teeth of Homo sapiens or Homo sapiens sapiens, depending on which anthropological source you're looking at, we recognize 32 teeth in the adult form and 20 teeth or deciduous teeth in the subadult or child form within the species. Dental formula becomes an important trait that is used by anthropologists and paleontologists as they are looking at change over time concepts. A dental formula basically is a dental count. It splits the dental arcade into an upper and lower, a maxillary and a mandibular expression of the teeth, and then it counts by dental type. So the human dental formula is 2 1 2 3, meaning we have 2 incisors, 1 canine, 2 premolars, and 3 molars. Now, a person might say, well, when you're taking into consideration the entire dental arcade, shouldn't that be double? The answer is yes. We're only doing this count on one side, either left or right, upper or lower dental arcade, to establish the formula. So for the adult form, if we were to split the dental arcade in half and just look at everything from the mid-sagittal plane to the posterior of that arc, we would count it 2, 1, 2, 3. 2 incisors, 1 canine, 2 premolars, and 3 molars. Now when we double this for the upper dental arcade and then we add the upper and lower, of course we get to our number of 32. In terms of deciduous dentition, we have a formula as well for the human species. Again, breaking down the mouth in the same manner, looking at incisors, canines, and in this case just molars. 2, 1, 2. So 2 incisors, 1 canine, and 2 molars. And that gives us our count of 20 teeth for the subadult or child expression of this trait. Now, there are a variety of anatomical terms that William Bass will introduce you to, and that will be common when you're looking at the anatomy of teeth and overall dentition in this case. And so let me share a few of those with you, and then I'll expand on a few of those as well. So first we have the crown. This is the part of the tooth that is situated above the gum line, and it is expressing this enamel material. So it's completely covered in dental enamel. Below that we have the neck, a slightly constricted portion, again just below the crown, and it's an area that we recognize to be a junction or a bridge between what lies below and of course the enamel of the crown. Then we have the root, kind of a third major portion of each and every tooth. This is the portion of the tooth below the crown and neck. It is enclosed in the tooth socket and covered with cementum. So we have the root, the portion completely enclosed in the tooth socket and covered with cementum. Then we have the neck, this transitional portion, and then we have the crown. Before I go any further, let me talk a little bit more about the anatomy of a tooth and why it's important. When we're talking about a tooth, we are basically looking at an accessory structure as it relates to the digestive system. So we relate the growth and development and the biomechanical nature and the physical nature of a tooth with the human digestive tract. They are, as I said, located in sockets, part of the alveolar process of both the mandible and the maxilla. The alveolar processes are covered by gingivae, or this kind of gum material, which extends slightly into each socket, forming that gingival sulcus. And you can see that on the diagram here in terms of where that gingiva is located. The sockets then are lined by the periodontal ligament, and that's important for keeping the tooth in place. It consists of, again, dense, fibrous connective tissue that is attached to the socket walls and the cemental surface, or the kind of root surface um, of the root portion of the tooth itself. It anchors the tooth in position and also acts as a kind of shock absorber to dissipate any of the forces that occur while chewing. So that cementum is kind of enveloping the tooth root, and then we have that periodontal ligament that kind of encapsulates and surrounds that surface, holding it into that alveolar region. A typical tooth, as I said before, consists of those three principal portions: the crown, that exposed portion, the root, and then of course the neck. And the neck is the most constricted of the three, being kind of a constricted junction between them, just below or at the gum line. Now the tooth, in terms of its overall makeup, we talked a little bit about enamel, but there are other important pieces to the tooth that we have to just keep in mind. We have dentin, and you can see on the diagram that that lies in the crown region just below the enamel. This is a calcified connective tissue that gives the tooth its basic shape and rigidity. It's probably the most important aspect of the tooth itself. It encloses a cavity. The enlarged part of the cavity is referred to as the pulp cavity. It lies in the crown and is filled with pulp. Pulp, in a sense, is a connective tissue that contains blood vessels and nerves, even lymphatic vessels. Then this pulp cavity extends and narrows as it runs toward the alveolar region into the sockets which hold the teeth, and it runs through the root system of the tooth itself. Where the pulp cavity navigates through the root is referred to as the root canal. Each root canal has an opening at its base referred to as the apical foramen. Through the foramen, as we see in the diagram here, we have blood vessels that bear nutrients, including the lymphatics, which allow for protection, and then of course nerves, which we associate with sensation. The dentin of the crown is covered by the enamel. That consists primarily of a calcium phosphate and a calcium carbonate. Another wonderful place of storage for calcium in the human skeletal system. And this enamel is the hardest substance or surface in the body itself. It protects the tooth from the wear of chewing. Enamel can also be considered a barrier against acids, especially those associated with the oral cavity and the foods that we eat. And again, if we didn't have this enamel, the dentin would be rapidly destroyed on a biochemical level by the acidity of the oral cavity. Below then the enamel, the dentin is still protected. When we get at and below the gum line, the root is covered with this cementum. It's another bone-like material that attaches the root to that periodontal ligament. So each and every part of the anatomy of the tooth is important, either for protection or it is associated with the wear and tear that is connected to the breakdown of our foods, the production of greater surface area on our foods, and then of course the oral cavity itself with its acidic nature and the number of enzymes that are associated with the breakdown of our foods acting on that expanding surface area all of that, in a sense, can be reflected in the anatomy of the tooth. Now, what's interesting about teeth as you're starting to work your way through the Bass text is that the functionality of the tooth is reflected in its crown, and to a lesser extent, the amount of stress and strain, along with the location of the tooth. So the stress and strain that's associated with the tooth and its location, I guess, would be a better way of saying that. This all is then reflected in the overall design, especially that at the neck and in the root. So when you're talking about incisors, they have an incisiform shape to them. This incisiform shape allows the slicing or the shearing of material as it's being processed in the mouth. Canines, they have a completely different kind of occlusal surface or chewing surface. It has a single cusp in this case. They are tearing. So they are designed to grab and tear food. We get to the premolars and molars. The premolars will have shearing and tearing qualities to the occlusal surface, but they will also have a cusping design that allows the grinding process to begin. And then the molars are the grinders, right? So all of these buccal teeth, rather, they will have that grinding as part of their overall design, and it's best expressed in the surface area of the crown. And again, a crown index incorporates, or it's a measure of in some way, the shape and the surface area of the tooth. And then it is also, in a sense, expressed in their location and the overall size of the tooth itself. Right? What's being required, what's being asked of that tooth. And as food moves from the anterior portion of the oral cavity to the posterior portion of the oral cavity, we see this process of shearing and tearing, slicing and grinding, and eventually the end result is to have a very well expressed surface area for, in this case, the digestive system to begin to break down and extract the necessary nutrients from whatever is being eaten. The last thing that I'll say in relation to the anatomy of a tooth relates to, in this case, the anatomical surface or surfaces of the tooth itself. And one I have mentioned in terms of that occlusal surface, but there are 5 that William Bass identifies. A labial surface or a buccal surface relates to the outer edge of the tooth itself and what portion of the oral cavity is coming in contact with it. So when we're talking about a labial surface, this is going to be associated with the lips, whereas a buccal surface is going to be associated with the cheek. A lingual surface, there's only one expression of this, a lingual surface is a side that is kind of opposite of what I just mentioned. It is the side that faces the interior of the oral cavity, in this case, the side that faces the tongue, hence the term lingual. Occlusal, which I mentioned before, is the chewing surface itself, that surface of the tooth that comes into contact with not only other teeth in the opposing jaw, but also the food material that is being processed or ground. We have a mesial surface, a 4th area. This is the surface of the tooth that lies against an adjoining tooth and faces the midline of the body. And remember, we're dealing with an arch, right? A dental arch. So it has a more rounded shape. That mesial surface will orient it a little bit different on each of the teeth based upon where they are in that dental arcade. But again, it's always either facing the anterior portion of the skull or the interior of the oral cavity as you move from the posterior portion with the molar all the way around the arc and eventually get to the incisor, which has the classic mesial expression of that surface, where it is directly facing the midline of the body. And then finally, we have the distal surface, the surface of the tooth that lies against an adjoining tooth, but faces away from the median line or the mid-sagittal line of the body. This also, as you move throughout the dental arcade, will be slightly different for each of the dental types and each of the dental locations. It will be in its classic expression in the anterior portion of the oral cavity. However, as it moves from the incisor eventually to the molar, it will begin to have a little less characteristic and easy to identify location as to this distal surface. When it reaches the kind of buccal portion of the oral cavity, it will be facing the posterior. And this is why terms like mesial and distal sometimes will only be applied to the first three dental types, the incisors, the canines, and the premolars. The molars, because they have such a linear orientation and they have a buccal row to them where they're facing anterior posterior, sometimes that mesial distal will be people will prefer not to use that and will focus more on lingual buccal anterior and posterior for the various surfaces that are in that exposed crown, and of course occlusal being on top of all of that, that facing the other dental arcade, and of course the food that is being processed. I've given you a lot to think about. Take a moment to organize your notes and then review this kind of blown up expression of the anatomy of a tooth diagram. Locate the various locations and take a look at their functionality, and then consider some of these surfaces and relate all of this to your BAS readings. For the remainder of the lecture, I'll be using these two diagrams, and I will start by talking about the teeth as they relate to growth and development. So we will start with the subadult or the deciduous expression of teeth. There will be some general terms and ideas there that can be applied to the adult forms, but we won't expand on that until we get into the adult forms themselves. However, when we look at the architecture of the teeth, comparing the deciduous teeth to the adult forms, the incisors will function the same way, the canines will function the same way, and many of the physical characteristics that are described in the BAS text for identifying these teeth will be nearly identical. It'll just come down to size, and it is important when you're doing dental analysis to compare apples to apples, in the sense that you would be comparing juvenile expressions of dentition to other juvenile expressions as part of a collection, and then adult to adult. Okay, so let's step back and start to work our way through the dentitions. We'll start with the juvenile. So everyone has two dentitions. They have this juvenile expression and then the adult expression. The first of the dentitions is the deciduous, right? The milk teeth or the baby teeth. These begin to erupt at about 6 months of age, and one pair appears at each month thereafter until you hit that initial number of 20. Remember, in the subadult or child form, we are dealing in this case with only 3 types of teeth, not 4, which we'll see in the adult form. The 3 would be the incisors, canines, and molars, whereas in the adult form we have incisors, canines, premolars, and molars. Let's talk a little bit about each of these initial 3 types. We'll start with the incisors. So the incisors, these are the teeth that are closest to the midline. They are chisel shaped and adapted for cutting into food, incising the food in a sense. They are referred to, again, whether they're upper or lower, as either central or lateral. Central being closest to the midline, lateral being one step, in this case, away from the midline. And as incisors, and due to their location in this parabolic dental arch or this dental arcade, they will express the typical labial lingual, mesial, distal in terms of surfaces. And then they, of course, have occlusal. So the idea here is that they are going to give us our best expression of those typical dental surfaces as they relate to the crowns. So, central or lateral? Central, closest to the midline, lateral, a step away in a sense. And when we're looking at the incisors, the thing to keep in mind is that the central expression, whether it's upper or lower, will have the better expression of the more chisel-like, typical incisiform shape, meaning they will have that shovel-like quality to them. They will have a wider surface as it relates in the crown closest to the occlusal surface, so it'll be wider, closer to the cutting surface than what we find at the top of the crown or at the neck. And then within that kind of typical incisiform pattern, the centrals will again have the greatest hyper expression of that. The laterals will then become a little more narrow. They will still retain some of that overall measurement as it relates to whether we're closest to the cutting surface or to the neck. But the lateral expressions will be more challenging to identify because, for example, in the upper lateral, we will see qualities that will be very similar to a lower central incisor just by their size and shape. There are additional cusps on the lingual side that will allow us then to distinguish between the two. But that's where the confusion can occur. And the central incisors, though, upper central, they will be the easiest to distinguish, right? They'll have that very uniform, very almost straight root system to them, very elongated root system, and then they will also have that classic expression of the incisiform shape of the crown. Next to our central and lateral incisors, then we have our cuspids or our canines. In the deciduous form, as it is with the adult form, they are the tooth to have, or the first tooth in this arcade to have a cusp. It would be a single cusp, and that's what makes it easy to identify with regard to the crown. The problem is wear. Wear over time will result in that cusp being worn down, and so you can have especially in the deciduous, but also in the adult, a lower canine, left or right, starting to express incisor-like qualities to it with regard to that occlusal surface because of wear. So you have to be very, very careful, and that's where you look at the overall shape of the crown and what's happening on that lingual side to be able to say, okay, it has wear on it, but it's clearly a canine. The other thing to keep in mind is that when we're talking about cuspids, they are designed to tear and shred. So they incise and tear, just like the incisors are more for the shredding of food or the incising cuts with regard to the food surfaces. The cuspids, the canines now, are going to do a little bit of both, but when we look at them in their purest design or their purest form, they really are designed for tearing, gripping and tearing. With regard to the crown, or the root system rather, the incisors and the cuspids only have one root piece. This is good for creating large categories in dental fragments, but it is challenging when you have wear, as I said before, and then the similarity between the teeth as it relates to the root systems. So incisors and canines all have a single root. That makes it a challenge. The angle of the root for the canines, however, will be better expressed. It will be pointing as you move toward the apex of the root, it will be pointing toward the side that it is sourced to, whereas the incisors are much more linear, and that is most expressed for those central incisors. They are the most linear of all of them, running almost perpendicular to that mid line of the body. So incisors, canines all have one root apiece. And we find this in the adult and the deciduous, but we've been focusing now on this deciduous first. Then in the deciduous, behind the canines, lie the first and second molars. Remember, we don't have premolars in our deciduous arcade. Each of these deciduous molars have 4 cusps on their occlusal surface. Upper molars, and we'll see this pattern with the adult, upper molars have 3 roots, whereas lower molars only have 2 roots. The molars, adult or deciduous, are designed to crush and grind. Okay, all deciduous teeth generally will be lost unless there is some sort of trauma or there is some sort of congenital growth issue associated with these arcades. And this loss of teeth, and of course there's a replacement, but generally the loss of the deciduous teeth occurs between ages 6 and 12 years. They are then replaced by the second set of teeth, which I'll start to talk about, which is our permanent or secondary dentition. The permanent dentition in the human model consists of 32 teeth that appear again between the ages of 6 years and adulthood. It resembles the deciduous dentition with a few exceptions. The deciduous molars are replaced with the first and second premolars, or these bicuspids. Why do we call them bicuspids? Because in the molars we see the 2 cusp design. You have an outer cusp, buccal, you have an inner cusp, lingual, and in terms of that occlusal surface, and then you have that kind of area between the cusps, and it creates these kind of 2 almost ridge-like expressions to the cusps. So an outer and an inner ridge, even though they're technically cusps. And the shape of these cusps and the inferior projection of those cusps will be important to identify the first molar, premolar rather, from the second premolar, and the upper premolar, 1 and 2, from the lower premolar, 1 and 2. The other thing that will be important is the root system for being able to establish premolars. Do they have what appears to be almost a fused 2 cusp or 2 root design, or do they have a single root that extends? And what direction does that root seem to be pointing in? It allows us to orientate up or lower and left or right. So again, the first and second premolars are bicuspids. They have 2 cusps and then generally 1 root, but it has this unique design with regard to the shape of the root, and that helps us. It almost looks like a fused 2-root system when we're looking at its shape. Now what's ironic about all of this is if you go back further into the human record and beyond the human record in terms of the assumptions made by biological anthropologists, sometimes you will see 2 roots in these expressions where the root in the modern human form almost looks like those 2 roots have been fused together, but you can still see the slight differentiation between the 2, and that's kind of an interesting subject, one that we won't be covering here, but one that definitely connects some of the overall dots with regard to the amount of space that exists within that alveolar region and how that is expressed in the root systems as well. The 2 cusps single root generally system for the first and second premolars all lead to their or connect with their ability for breaking down food. Generally, they are designed to crush and grind. And then we have behind them the permanent molars, which erupt into the mouth behind them, and at approximately 6 years for our first molar, 12 years for our second molar, and then the third molar, this wisdom tooth, generally will be assigned to somewhere after the age of 18. Now, the idea of space and dental crowding, as we have noted that the shape of the human face has become a little more flattened, less prognathic over time, this becomes important for understanding how, if at all, the third molar forms or erupts, or if there is a problem with the eruption. But in terms of the genetic coding for our teeth and the dental formula that is associated with the human species, we do recognize a fully developed third molar after the age of 18. The molars themselves then are for crushing and grinding. The root systems of the molars and the cusping that is associated with the interior of the mouth can help distinguish, in this case, upper, lower, and side. The other thing that's important about the molars is their cusping system is a Y5 cusping system, meaning there are 5 distinguished or distinguishable cusps on that occlusal surface, and the shape of that intercusp region on that occlusal surface generally has this kind of Y shape to it. So a Y5 cusping pattern is found in the upper crowns of the molars, and then the lower crowns of the molars have this 4 cusp pattern. So Y5 upper, very unique to the human species, but also unique to all great apes, and then a 4 cusp lower pattern in the molars of the lower dental arcade. And we find this again with all 3 of the cusp expressions, upper, lower. Then upper cusps, or upper root system rather, 3, with the exception of the wisdom tooth and that crowding, but it again appears to have a kind of fused 3 root system when you look at the shape of the root and some of these implied divisions between the roots or root ends. And then in the lower, the root system will be 2. And again, in that third molar, sometimes those 2 will have a 50% or higher fusion expression due to the crowding that occurs with that third tooth. So just to review here real quickly, Y5, 5 cusp pattern, upper molar, 4 cusp pattern, lower with regard to the occlusal surfaces, 3 roots to the upper. The orientation of the roots will also help with siding them, and that kind of large lingual root hyper expressed in that first molar, and then 2 roots to the lower molars. A lot to take in. Compare what I've described here to what you have in the Bass book. Go over each tooth within the arcade, look at its upper and lower expression, and look at some of the differences in terms of these landmarks, those associated with the root and the crown, to be able to distinguish the upper from the lower and the left from the right. And then pause the video here as well to look at the eruption ages associated with each of the different dental groups. Compare the deciduous to the adult, and keep in mind the lack of those premolars in the deciduous expression. This all together will help you to identify not only where the teeth are located, the teeth themselves, but then also it will help you to understand their biomechanical nature and the unique expression that we see in the human model.